Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 2. We are closer to the bottom of page 1169, Aleph Kuf Samach Tes. And as I mentioned yesterday, all these pages have now already been posted on ayinbeis.com. AYINBEIS.com. You can find PDFs of the exact pages we're learning. So, in this mimer, we've been talking about the two levels of Ayin throughout Hishtalshelus. The Ayin is that channel, that field of energy between the creator and the creation. So the two poles is the creator all the way to the top, called the Yesh Amiti. The creation is the Yesh Hanivre all the way at the bottom, so to speak, at the other end of the spectrum. And in order to be a relationship between the two, both in the process of creation and the process of connection through Avodah, that the Yesh below existence should retrace the steps of this entire process and climb that ladder, the stepping stones. So we have Ayin in between, which divides it generally into two categories, to two levels. The Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, like every memutza, every interface, has a combination of both elements it's connecting, both entities it's connecting. So the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, so to speak, represents the Yesh Amiti, called Ayin Amiti. Its function, its role is utter bittul, complete sublimation, and expressing and reflecting the divine. He called it ha'ara of Elokus. It's not atzmus, but it's nothing but the divine. And then there's the Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra, which is the divine energy that manifests and relates to existence. And there the perspective is not from Yesh to Ayin, from the Yesh Amiti to the levels beneath it, but the opposite way, that we start from the Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra, and the Ayin here, we start from the Yesh Hanivra, and the Ayin here means an Ayin that is not of the same substance as existence. It's a mysterious entity that we also cannot comprehend. And that relates to existence. And these are the two days, Das Elyon and Das Tachten. One in the Ayin of Yesh Amiti is Das Elyon, the perspective from above, and then the Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra is Das Tachten. Now, where these two levels are, we've already established it's everywhere, really. And the Rebbe Rashab has laid it out, whether it's higher than Atzilus, Biyah. I'll go over briefly. Earlier in the Maimarim, he spoke about three different interpretations in these two levels of Ayin. One before the Tzimtzum, one Sevav and Mamala, and one after Mamala Kalalman itself. But when we started spelling it out more in detail in Hishtalshelus itself, so what we've learned is that we have that Atzilus would be Das Elyon, because Atzilus is Elokus, so it's the Ayin of the Yesh Hamitri, and according to that, Biyah would be the Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra, would be the second lower level. Then in the same last Maimer that he went deeper and said, in Atzilus itself you have both. In Chachma of Atzilus itself you have both. And another interpretation was Chachmilah, Chachma and Malchus in Atzilus. One Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, one Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra. I'm just going very quickly through it. In this Maimer, as he dug deeper into the Pasach Eliyahu, which explains the process, which describes the process, I should say, of how from Antu Chad V'lei B'Chushbon, from the utter unity that's immeasurable, emerges Afikoslan, 10 garments, 10 spheres. He says that when you look at it, it seems that all of the spheres, all of Atzilus, is for the purpose of creation. Hence, Atzilus would then be in the category of the Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra. So where's the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti then? It would be higher than Atzilus. And that itself, he dug deeper and broke that down two further. That higher than Atzilus would be Keser. But in Keser itself, they also have the two. The Chetzenis of Keser and the Primis of Keser. And in Primis of Keser itself, in Atik, we also have the two. Radlah and the Gimel Rishenis and the Radlah of Atik and the lower levels of Atik. So that's what we learned yesterday. Then he started by Inyanhu, he said, to understand that when the B'chlol is the two levels of Ayin, is the Primius and Chitzenius of the Kav. So now we're moving upward. The Kav, of course, is the first emanated energy that comes after the Tzimtzum. It precedes Keser, it precedes Atik and Arich, it precedes all the levels lower. So the Kav now, he's describing the Kav, because the Kav is the main force, the creative force, you could say the divine paintbrush that paints and creates all of existence. So now we began learning the Kav. We focused primarily so far on the Chitzenius of the Kav.
I have a question.
Can I finish my summary and then we'll have questions?
Okay.
Okay, so we started speaking about the middle of the page, 1169, about the Kav. And he made it clear that the Kav, we're talking about Chitzenius Kav, then we're going to move to Primius Kav a little next page. So right now, Chitzenius Kav, what's the Kav's role? The Kav, as I described, as we explained, is a narrow flow of energy. It's not expansive like the Erein Sof Poshet Mamala Kol HaMetzias. The whole purpose of the Kav is to create. It's a channeler of energy. In the Moshel, the famous example of the Alter Rebbe, whose Yartzeit is the Alkus today, Chavdal Tevis, is that the teacher, after concealing his brilliance, begins a flow of consciousness, a flow of energy to the student. So the whole purpose of the Kav is to reach the student. So right there you see that the Kav is about existence. Let's say the Cha'elamus, for the purpose of existence. So he breaks it down further. He said, the Kav, I'm just going to go sum up to where we're up to. He said, okay, the Negillah Kav Hanimshach Be'elam is Babachinis Chalkus. The Kav comes in distinctions and eslapshus and engages. It's not makif. It's not aloof and removed. The Kav is an engager, an engaging force that relates to and manifests into existence, and is actually made up of ischalkus, of levels. The Kav has levels, he says, because the Kav, the line, is made up of what? Of nekudas. Nekudas are points. They're not yet Eris and Kalim and Atzilus complete functioning faculties or attributes, but there are nekudas, which is nishanifra to us spheres b'madregas pratis. Lifnei Tzimtzum, the 10 hidden spheres, where the Kav originates from, there the spheres don't have any substance. It's all within God's vision, envisioning existence, allocating resources. It's all within the artist's mind, so to speak. But here we're dealing already, a Kav is an actual flow of energy that has begun, the shaping of the spheres have begun to take shape. Like he says, but there they're completely united. They're completely part of a higher reality. And that's why you say, Antu chad v'lei b'chushban. You are one but not measurable. And through the Tzimtzum, however, the spheres that were before the Tzimtzum completely absorbed, completely immersed in a higher consciousness called divine consciousness of Erein Sof. So now they become nifratu kol sfira b'fnei, and that's the Kav, which is made up of nekudas. So the Kav is carrying now the DNA and essentially the building blocks called the spheres of existence. Yet at the same time, it's still in the form of Esses spheres bli ma. Remember, it's not yet in Kalim, so it's not yet a fully developed entity. So it's a Esses spheres ma, and that's why they're nekudas. They're just points. We don't yet have a shetach. We don't yet have a plane, a whole structure. Okay. Then he says, and afterwards it comes and manifests in the containers, where the oil gets further concealed. And now he comes back and reconnects it to the words of the Magid in the Torah, that the Eibishter asa kamet, v'Hakadosh Baruch Hu asa kamet tzimtzumim, derech kama elamis, which means in order to create and that the light should be able to be received by the recipients, you can't have the full intensity of the light. So God made number of tzimtzumim, of diminishments, and traveling through a bunch of elamis stages, as we discussed, we learned much earlier. And there comes tzimtzum madrega lemadrega, l'bchinas islapshus ve'helam. So this Kav is now undergoing this process. It comes after the tzimtzum initiation, the great big tzimtzum, and then it continues as the journey of the light continues into becoming functional containers, into functional existence in Atzilus and so on. There is the tzimtzumim madrega to madrega, level by level. Shagam ha'islapshus b'chinas keser. Oh no, that's where we stopped. We stopped, I believe, right there. We'll get to it shortly. Okay, that's a summary of where we are. We're middle of this discussion of the kav, how the kav is essentially already relating to existence, very high level, but it's relating and made up of nekudas. And we're going to soon discuss more details about this. And then we're going to go to the Pnimius HaKav. Because remember, you said that the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra is the outer dimension of the Kav, and then there's the inner dimension of the Kav, which we'll discuss shortly. Okay, if anybody has any questions, please.
It's and say in the beginning of this ice, it says that the kav is ayin.
No, he says the kav has two levels, Chassidus and Pnimius HaKav. The two levels of ayin is the two dimensions of the kav.
Okay.
That's what he says.
And what would that be in relation to the Makai Mapanoi? Is that I always thought the
I explained yesterday at length how it works. After the Tzimtzum, there's complete darkness. There's a complete empty vacuous space.
Is that considered ayin?
No, who says that's ayin? He's talking ayin of bittul telekus. Why is he's not calling it ayin at all? Ayin is the kav, is the two levels of ayin. What ayin? We're not. This is not the translation of the word ayin. This is two levels of ayin in the shtalshlus. One is it's all Ayin is oir. There's two levels of oir. A oir that's completely a reflection of its source, and an oir that manifests within existence. This is what the whole theme they've been learning the last 10, 15 pages, if not more.
Yeah, no, I've just always thought that the Makai Mapanoi is the ayin.
I don't know what you thought based on what?
Based on what I've learned about the Seder Shtalshalos.
Okay, so listen, find a mimer where if you mean that Tzimtzum is a type of a pause between Lifnei Tzimtzum, La'achrat Tzimtzum, correct, but that's not what he's discussing here. Here we're discussing in Oyer itself two levels of Ayin. In Oyer.
Okay.
It's not a contradiction. Because if you're talking about the idea that between the Yesh and Yesh you need a Tzimtzum, that's correct. But here he's discussing it in terms of between the Yesh and Yesh you need some type of channel that connects the two. In this context, the Tzimtzum is all part of causing the Oyer to relate more to existence. Like I explained in the second interpretation, if you go back to page, I referred to it yesterday, if you go back to page, where is it? Yeah. Page 1148, 1149, he talks about how before the Tzimtzum, or actually 1149, 1150, before the Tzimtzum and after the Tzimtzum is an Ayin. But there he talks about the Ayin as in terms of, as I said, the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, even before the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum is all part of the process of making the Oyer become relatable to existence. So anywhere you hear about Tzimtzum Ayin, it would be part of the process that you need the Tzimtzum to create an Oyer like the Kav to be able to relate to existence. That's the context, if you want to reconcile the two. Okay. So continuing on, he says like this. Oh, actually, we did read further. Sorry. We did read further. Let me sum up the next lines. Even the Hislapshus b'chinas Keser. Remember, before we said Keser, compared to Atzilus, is like the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, or the two levels in Keser itself. He says that too, Keser is also a Helam. She is Salam Er B'Deshiyeh Be'efshel Iskabel Be'elamis. So even the level of Keser is also subject to some form of concealment. As we learned, if you remember, we learned that, what did he say? Kisrei law is what's the lashon there? No. Eir tzach mitzuchtzach. Eir Yeah, tzach u'mitzuchtzach. Right. Ucham hu legabe ilis ha'ilus. And he explained that keser, kisri law, keser is a very high level, but compared to higher, it's a form of concealment. Okay. And then he continues, as we learned earlier as well, this kamet tzimtzum then comes v'yesh kama misochim u'parsoyis mereish kol dargin ad seif kol dargin. There are a number of curtains and partitions from the highest levels to the lowest levels. This too, we learned at length earlier, the many different partitions that exist. V'hainu, and all this is due to the fact, v'hainu, this means, l'fisha kav inyanehu, because the kav, the inyan of the kav is, the purpose and the function of the kav is, sheyi aydezeh hisavu se'elamus, that through it should be the creation, the bringing the worlds into existence, u'sheyi gilui er be'elamus, like I said, that there should be existence and there should be a gilui er in existence, in a way, lefi eifim mitziyusam v'savusam, measured and tailored to the eifim, to the particular structure of each part of existence. So you see that the kav, its inyan, is defining and shaping and creating existence. I'm reading now inside. We'll start from here. The line starts eifim mitziyusam v'savusam. And for this purpose was the tzimtzum and eid ein sof in the first place. To do what? In order sheyeh gili eir be'eifim kazeh sheyeh nitfez teichelam ha-tzimtzum. What was the tzimtzum? Like an example of the teacher and the student. The tzimtzum is a concealment, not as an end in itself. It's in order to allow the flow. It's to regulate and measure and channel the energy in a way that it can be received by existence. Within the helm of the tzimtzum, which means in the state of a new consciousness that has arisen after the tzimtzum, in that helm, you want to have an oir that fits into the new structure that was created here. In other words, the tzimtzum has two aspects to it. One is the concealment, and one is to channel afterwards the flow in a way that can be received by the recipients that are on the other side of the tzimtzum. So when the teacher first has a brilliant idea, it's infinite energy. In that space, there is no space for anything else. The first thing the teacher has to do, the Rav, is to completely conceal his brilliance. He needs to leave room for a student to arrive and be able to be in his presence and not be overwhelmed by all of this and be annihilated by it. So first is concealment. The concealment is in order for now the kav to flow within the helm of the tzimtzum. In this concealed state, now you want something to flow, but you don't want it to just go back to the flowing as it was before the tzimtzum. You want whatever air that's being generated should be regulated and defined according to the structure or the student and students that were on this side in the helm of the tzimtzum. That's what he's saying. And this was discussed much earlier, as I pointed out yesterday, the Maimorim where this was talked about. Commission is barely ill, right? The kol zeh and all this is lefisha klolos. Kol zeh lefisha klolos gili hakav, because the general revelation of this thread of energy, this line, hurak ha'ored da ha'ored levad. It's only a reflection of a reflection. Remember that he already associated with the ayin of yesh hanivra, not just a reflection of a reflection. Like we spoke before about Malchus back in, where was the thing? Previous mimer. We discussed at length ha'ara da ha'ara. Where was that? Was it 1163? Or earlier, I think even earlier. Oh yeah, page 1159. There he discussed ha'ara da ha'ara. Yeah. Havayan, okay, good. So it's a reflection of reflection. Why? Because Lifnei Tzimtzum is the first ha'ara, as he's going to explain now. We ruled it yesterday, but I'm going to elaborate more now. The first Ayr is the Ayr before the Tzimtzum. This ha'ara of ha'ara is the Ayr after the Tzimtzum, the Kav. So he explains. What does that mean? In your light, nira appears light. So clearly there's two levels here. So he says, what's ba'ercha in your light? In your the ba'ercha is the Eid Ein Sof Shalifnei Tzimtzum. That's referring to the Eid Ein Sof Shagam Zehu Raka Or Levad. It's also ercha, your light. It's not you. It's your light. It's your Metzias Nimtze. It's a reflection of you, but it's not you. So it's also only ha'ara. As shall be explained shortly. Samach means nearby. Samach means soon. So in this ercha, nira eir, begili hakav. This ercha is nira eir, another level of eir. That's the revelation of the kav. La'acher tzimtzum, after the tzimtzum. So be'ercha nira eir, the way he's explaining it here is be'ercha, the eir and sof lifnei tzimtzum, nira eir, which means from there emerges and appears another level of light after the tzimtzum, and that's the kav. So that would make the kav a ha'ara of a ha'ara, reflection of a reflection, and of course followed by the paradigm leap of the tzimtzum. That's where we actually stop by the parentheses now. Now, remember, this is talking about one side of the kav as it relates more to existence. Don't forget, the kav is still intense divine energy. The kav itself needs to go through many concealments before it can actually enter into containers. Even chetzenius kav. But relative to higher than the kav, to the air before the tzimtzum, the kav now is a force that is directing the energy toward existence. That's what he's saying right now. Now in the parentheses, he's going to analyze the kav a bit more. Not really, actually, ideas we've already learned, but the Rebbe Rashab in his classic way is being thorough, wants to talk about this kav a little bit more. So this is a parenthesis that goes till the third line of the next page, 1170. So let's read the parentheses. So he says like this: V'hakav, this kav that we're talking about, that is flowing and regulating the energy in a way that relates to existence to the recipients. This kav is negei v'davuk ba'eid ein sof. We learned this earlier a number of times, even a little while back. The kav is not disconnected from its source. It's not like there was a tzimtzum. Take even physically. You could say a tzimtzum, you stopped the flow of energy, of divine energy. Now starts a kav. You could say maybe it's a new beginning. And the tzimtzum is like, let's think of it like a dam. Like you build a dam, stops the water from flowing, and through the dam comes now perhaps you open a hole and water flows. So even though the water is coming from the other side, but it's like a new state. So it's important to note that the kav is negei v'davuk be'eid ein sof. So yes, there's a pause. The tzimtzum definitely stopped the flow. Of course, it's not begashmis. It means it's a total concealment. But when the kav begins to flow again, it's it's coming from the mind of the teacher. The same teacher who has all that brilliance in his mind, he just concealed it from the students. But he himself still has all that knowledge. So the kav is coming and is attached to all his knowledge. However, the tzimtzum now is caused, as we're going to learn in a moment, that the kav should flow in a very regulated way and not just free flow without any untethered, unlimited. So it's negei v'davuk be'eid ein sof, so it maintains the integrity of eid ein sof. Remember, even the ayin of the yesh hanivra, asara mamoris nivra elam, is still mamoris of the Eibishter. Even though the divine energy is now enclothing itself and manifesting in a structured way, it's still fully connected. It's still oyer. It's not kalim. And it's definitely not nivraim. It's still oyer, So, but the Oyer is now being directed. The Kav is not like a separate reflection. Ha'ara nevdalis, we learned, would be it's a ha'ara, but it's with a leap. It's not a ha'ara nevdalis. It's attached to its source. On 1159, I think he explained the ha'ara nevdalis, if I recall correctly. In other words, in ha'ara, you have two types. You have ha'ara nevdalis and you have avdara that's not nevdalis. That's clearly what he's saying, because back there, on page 1159, the Rebbe Rashab said that the ha'ara of a ha'ara is a ha'ara nevdalis, and that's malchus. The malchus does not reflect, it's a koyach nivdal, because it doesn't reflect all of what the melech is about. It's like a separate force. But here he's saying the kav is not ha'ara nevdalis. Okay? So we can use some explanation. What's the difference between a reflection that's separate from and a reflection that's not? Remember, the kelim is not ha'ara. The kelim is nivdalas because it's a dveikus built in the keres. The kelim's focus is on the function of the entity. Here we're talking about oyer. Everything here is oyer. But in oyer itself, there can be many levels here. You can have the oyer completely unlimited before the tzimtzum, like the brilliance of the teacher. You can have the oyer on the other extreme would be a oyer that's somewhat separate. I think I gave the example of a mashal. If the teacher gives an example for the student, so though the example carries the idea, but that's already nivdelas because the example is from something that's not from the original idea. You're giving an example, let's say, to give you an example to understand the Ein Sof, let's give an example of a teacher. That's already not the same, it's not made of the same substance as the original idea. The nimshal and the mashal are not of the same matter. So therefore that you would call ha'ara because it is reflecting the nimshal, but it's nivdelas because it's from a davar zar. You're using an example from something outside of the idiom of the paradigm in which you are in. That would be an example. And in between would be the kav. The kav is not a mashal. The kav is actually a flow from the teacher, but it's a flow that is limited. So that's how I would explain it. So there's the ha'ara would be Ein Sof before the tzimtzum. Ha'ara, like the kav, would be a reflection of that, not without any foreign examples or anything like that. And ha'ara nevdelis would be, it's still oyer, because it's still seichel, but it's a seichel that has now taken on the shape of another mashal, a mashal from a completely different subject, just to help the student understand the original subject matter. And kelim, of course, is the structure, is the recipient itself. And the kelim is the structure of the idea, the words, the letters, as we discussed, the functionality of it, etc. Okay.
Rabbi Jacobson, the example of a mashal being maybe a way of understanding an ha'ara nivdalis, is that your example or is that brought down in Ayin Beis?
I don't remember specifically. It probably is in Ayin Beis in volume 1. My memory tells me, but if not, then I take responsibility for the mashal. Yeah. And there could be other mishalim. I recall, I believe in volume 1, he may have said it specifically. I'm looking back at 1159. Remember, a mashal itself can also be levels. If you remember, there's a mashal, there's a chida, a riddle. There are a lot of different levels. In volume 1, he spoke a lot about, in the Maimorim about Lovon. He speaks there about the language there was a Mesuderes and not Mesuderes. What was it? The two levels of a chida. In the Maimorim of about Sfiris.
No, because I was struggling to understand how the ha'ara could be nivdalis. That seemed to be impossible. But when you use that example, that's incredible. It opened up my eyes. It was a very important example for me. So just wanted to know if that comes from the Rebbeim.
As I said, I can't point right now to any mimer where I saw it. Either it's leitzig by me because it's like based on these Maimorim, or maybe even says it explicitly. I'd have to look. I'm being very transparent and telling you exactly. I can't remember exactly now. I'm just looking at one thing I could look. Oisi is built in Mesudarim and Asi is Mesudarim. Yeah, there are other examples as well, by the way. besides an example. But suffice for now. That's, I think, good enough for this discussion here. Okay. So you see here, I mean, just in the levels of communication, we've always talked about this. In level of communication, when a person is communicating, like I'm doing right now, or in written form, there's the oir of it, there's the kalim of it. The kalim are the expressions, like the words, the letters being used. The oir is the ideas. In the oir itself, you can have an oir that's the full intensity. You can have less intensity, like the kav, and you can have the examples, just to put it in context. Okay. So anyway, the kav, therefore, is davuk. That's what he says here. Negei of a davuk. It touches and is attached to Ein Ein Sof. That's the words of the Arizal. But until you don't have Chassidus, you don't know what does it mean it touches and it's attached. Obviously, we're not talking about physical attachments. You're talking about its personality. The kaf's personality is the same light as before the tzimtzum, but it's now channeled in a very specific way. I mean, go back to the example of the artist, just to make this not, I don't like to talk in abstract terms. The artist has infinite possibilities of creating art. We're not talking about the higher levels where he's not even an artist yet. In those infinite possibilities, he now envisions one, the 10 spheres. We know that's the level of the 10 hidden spheres before the tzimtzum, because it's all within the artist's possibilities. That one possibility is part of Bli Gvul. The Rebbe Shab said it very clearly throughout Ayin Beis. Bli Gvul, of the infinite possibilities, he's chosen one. So that one is still a part of the whole big Ein Ein Sof, infinite Ein Ein Sof. But we want existence. We can't just have God envisioning it, so to speak. So then comes at Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum conceals all the other possibilities altogether and reveals now this vision. The artist has now moved, instead of just being, what am I going to draw? What am I going to paint? Anything, I could do anything. No, I've determined it's going to be 10 spheres. It's going to have, using the muscle, it's going to have a sky, it's going to have water, some fish, some bushes, maybe a person. I mean, I'm just using that just to make it very tangible. In the language of spheres, it's going to have chokhmah, bina, das. Could God have done other spheres? Of course he could have. And he could have done these spheres itself in a different way. But this is what he's chosen. So now the tzimtzum is where the artist moves from the stage of all the potentialities. He's now going toward one. Now, the tzimtzum is necessary because you must conceal that whole Ein Sof. It's just too dominant. Even when you envision, Chassidus says clearly in Ayin Beis in many places, even when you're envisioning one of infinite, but the infinite is still overwhelming because it's there. So it's like one idea among billions of ideas. You got to, some way those billions of ideas have to be concealed to some extent. So the tzimtzum does that. The kav now carries the DNA, let's put it that way. That image of whatever the 10 spheres are, it's now carrying it into an operative flow of energy that is now measured because it's a kav, and as chokhmah bina is not yet, there's no kalim yet, so there's no canvas and painting yet, but in the artist, he right now is in a stage where he's ready to begin to paint, and in his mind, because he knows exactly, in the kav, he has the whole plan laid out, but it's still a plan. It's still oir. It's still his consciousness. And the kav is going to begin to shape and actually turn chokhmah into a full-bodied structure, and bina, that would be the sky, the birds, the bushes are now taking shape and form on a canvas. Now, the kalim, of course, are necessary because, first of all, he needs kalim, he needs a paintbrush, he needs paint, he needs a canvas. And kalim are also necessary because he has to take now this vision that he has in his mind and turn it into a real palpable and tangible image, which would become, in Atzilus, would be the first place where that image takes hold. But remember, it's not Gashmis. We're still talking about Ruchni's Dika structure, not a physical one. It's in this world where it becomes physical. But that's the general process. So if you think of the Kav, you see the Kav plays, of course, a critical role, because on one hand, it's carrying the message of the 10 hidden spheres. On the other hand, it's already now in a stage, as we've been discussing, that's relatable. It's beginning to channel it toward existence. So I'm spelling it out because that's exactly what he wants us to understand, how the Kav plays this role of this interface, and we'll soon learn about Primis Akav, and that fills the picture where we'll have the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti. Because now it's looks more like an Ayin of Yesh Nivra after the Tzimtzum. Obviously on a very high level, not like the Ayin of the Yesh Nivra, let's say, of Biyah, or even in Atzilus. But that's what he's doing. He's moving upward in this discussion. So now the parenthesis says it's Davuk, Negeiv Davuk, not Ha'ara Nivdalis. It's not in any, it's attached. V'hainu, continuing. V'hainu, this means Mipnei She'erein Sof Chazer V'Hoyer. Okay, wow, the Rebbe Rashab is being medaik every word here in Eitz Chaim. In Eitz Chaim, the words are, I already said, Eidei Sof Mamala Kolam Etzias, Poshet, Betachlas Apshitus, Ve'ein Loyhay Nesinis Mokum Klal Elems. There's no room for anything. Then comes at Tzimtzum Atzmei. The way he puts it is Silik Eirei Al Atzad. We know it's not Siluk Kipshute, it's not Tzimtzum Kipshute, it means utter concealment. And then, Achka Chazer V'Hoyer. These are the words of the Eitz Chaim. He returned and illuminated. Chazer v'hoyer. This, the Friedrich Rebbe says in the Sikha, I think in the Likutei Diburim, the Chiddush of my father, the Rebbe Rashab, and Chazer v'hoyer. Because the word Chazer, if it just said v'hoyer, you could say, you know what? It's like a new chapter. The Kav is a new chapter. It is a new chapter, but Chazer means he returned. That means the Eirei Sof that was there before is now is returning, is making a return appearance through the kav. Obviously, albeit in a way that's mitzumtzum and narrow and a kav, but the Chazer tells you that the kav retains something from lifnei tzimtzum. That's what he's saying now. So, and then he goes on and says the kav is negei v'davuk, which in a way is a similar idea. It's attached and touches, but he's saying even more Chazer v'hoyer. Let's see what he says, that it returns. So it's Chazer v'hoyer. So therefore the kav is davuk because it's returning. The light that was there before is returning, but returning in a structured or a limited way. But on the other hand, so go back and forth. Aval ha'idei hefsek hatzimtzum. But it comes through the pause, through the what did we say? Hefsek. We said another word. Pause was another word. Through the hefsek means when you pause. But there's another word, a good word we found earlier when we were talking about hefsek. Okay, for now I'll use the word pause. It's the pause of the tzimtzum, hefsek.
Would gap be a good word?
Yeah, gap is fine. I'm thinking of a different word, but gap is also the gap of the tzimtzum, hefsekat tzimtzum. It means something happened in between. In other words, you could have a situation.
When you said
parsa is a partition. Parsa is a partition. It's not a hefsek. Parsa is a different meaning. Okay, so you could have a situation where you stop the flow of something, and then a new stage begins, and you don't call it a continuation, so to speak. You don't call it chazer v'hoyer. It's like a new thing, new beginning, empowered maybe by the earlier stage. But here clearly it's flowing. So on one hand, there's a pause, a hefsek. On the other hand, whatever flows is attached to and is a return of what was there before in this limited way, in this regulated flow is maybe better than limited. Okay. So this hefsek hatzimtzum, aval the hefsek hatzimtzum she'ein ze b'chinas dveikus mamish, k'may dveikus she'b'chinas gili ha'etzem. So now he's spoken the other side of the thing. So it's true, the oyer is still attached because it's still oyer, but because it comes to the hefsek hatzimtzum, which is not dveikus mamish. That means it's not dveikus mamish, because if it was mamish attached, it would just be one unceasing flow, incessant or unceasing flow from the core. In other words, the oyer before the tzimtzum is Gilia Etzem. There's no Tzimtzum altogether. So what you have there is the Etzem is just flowing through the Oir, is being revealed, the reflection of the Oir. The Kav, on one hand, yes, it's still Oir and attached, but it did go through something. Something did happen. The Kav was affected by the Tzimtzum. That's obvious. So on one hand, it's attached light, but on the other hand, it's not Dveikus Mamish because it's not like the Gili Hat'oir that it's coming through that is Pre-Tzimtzum, that's just Gili Ha'etzem.
Why not? When your mashal about the dam earlier, the water, even though it is concentrated and limited and defined, it still can double mamish to the water that's dammed up. It comes from that same source.
So if you talk physically, yes, that water has the same taste and the same color and the same quality of the water before the dam. But when you talk about Ruchnius, what we have to explain, what is the Tzimtzum's role? So the Tzimtzum's role, as I explained, earlier before the Tzimtzum is like the chief of staff. All it is a reflection of what the Etzem wants. There's no room there for details or functionality. The after the Tzimtzum is continuing and following those orders to a T. It will never waver because it's still and it's made of the same substance, meaning it's all about what God wants. But now it's about God manifesting in Yehi Rakia, in Chachma Bina. It focuses on the functionality. We've learned this at length. He's just applying it now to the Kav. So the Lifnei Tzimtzum, its role is just gili, whatever the Etzem wants to reveal is being revealed. And in order to make it in a way that we can understand it, this goes through a Tzimtzum, and now it's not fully under the, let's put it this way, it's not fully consumed by the source, but it's because of the Tzimtzum, it allows the Oyer to do its function. Like I spoke the example of a Shliach. If a Shliach would be so bottled to the Mishaleach, to the Rebbe, that he cannot do anything, he can't run a minyan, he can't open a school, he can't raise money, because he's completely consumed with the Rebbe. That's all. It's like as if he's sitting in the Rebbe's room, in Yechidus, and the Rebbe's presence is dominant. He wouldn't fulfill the shlichus. The shlichus is necessary that you should be always loyal and preserve the integrity of your shlichus. Never waver from what you're supposed to do, but you have to, in a way, feel like you're outside of the presence of the Yechidus for you to be able to even function. Because remember, in the presence of its source, is kishraga betira. It's like a candle in the light of the sun. That's the lowest level of bittul. The highest levels of bittul, the is completely doesn't have any substance of its own. So we need really both sides. We need utter bittul. That would be the that gilia etzem. And we need, however, a bittul. The kav is also bittul, but it's a bittul that allows room for another so you can do your function. And the goal, of course, is to create the bittul ayesh, which will ultimately lead to bittul b'mitzias. The goal is to really combine the two, but we're not at that stage right now. First, you have to begin with allowing room for another. And that's where the kav is taking Ein Sof and essentially saying, okay, here, I'm putting it on a platter. It's a kav, it's going to shape existence, chachma, bina, das. In these highest levels, they're all consumed with elikus, but they're not consumed with elikus to the point that they don't have a shape and form. If chachma would be so bottled that it completely loses its personality, that's not chachma. You need chachma, you need bina, you need seichel, midas. We need to have structure, because at the end of the day, God, the same atzmus that gave off also gave off a kavana called dira b'tachtenim. He wants a daimim to be different than semeach and chai medaber, and he wants Pesach to be different than Sukkot. If you're completely consumed with Asher Kedeshanu B'Mitzoysev V'Tzivonu, you can forget. Remember the story I told about Levi Yitzchak Barditchever, that the chicken ran off because he was so bedveikus. The Rebbe Rashab, he was in the middle of a maimer, his eyes were closed. He didn't even know that there was a table missing in front of him. The kavanah is to bring down that Ein Sof now into a specific detail. So therefore, the kav is necessary in that sense. So the tzimtzum allows for the to basically to diminish that intensity, like leaving the yechidus room. It's similar to what we speak about Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres, we learned the mashal actually in the last maimer, in the beginning of this maimer. Shmini Atzeres The Eibishter says, before you go off, he tells his princess or prince, whatever the mashal is, before you go off into the winter months, where you're going to leave my palace, Tishrei, the month of Tishrei, Kasha alai pridaschem, it's difficult for me, your separation. And the Rebbe explains, why does it say pridaschem, not pridasenu? Because God is not separating from us, but we, in our perception after the Tzimtzum, are now an independent entity. And that's necessary, because that's the way you make a dir b'tachtenim. At the same time, we want to make sure that we're connected to and attached to the kavanah. So basically, it's two levels of oir. One that's carrying whatever the divine etzem is desiring, and one that's focused on the function and the details and the structure. Okay.
Beautiful.
It's like you said, Ein zed veikus mamish.
Yes.
Right. This is constant, as you see, constantly in Ayin Beis. He always, I pointed out many times, he says it's dveikus, but then he says not mamish. The word mamish is used a lot because it means you need to have it's a subtle difference. Because on one hand, you cannot say the kav is not David, because that would be in the mashal shliach who's moel b'shlichusei, he's not even mekayim what the mishaleach wants. He's off on his own agenda. Then there's no dveikus altogether. On the other hand, if it's complete and unfettered dveikus, you have that. So this is why it was a big chiddush when it says that Aaron HaKohen, the big chiddush lo shina, that when he lived in Meneda, he didn't change anything from the way it was instructed. And the Rebbe asked, what's the big chiddush? Aaron HaKohen shouldn't change the instructions. Why would you think that he would wander away and waver from the God's instructions?
Wow.
So the Rebbe answers, because his dveikus was so deep and the klois hanefesh that you can lose sight of the details. The chiddush was that even though he was completely attached, he still maintained that composure, the ability to focus, do this detail now, because we can get into a state of klois hanefesh, into lifnei tzimtzum, and then completely lose sight of what needs to be done. As you know, there's just another explanation of this point.
Amazing, really.
It's he'ore de'ore, but not he'ore nivdelas.
Right.
Exactly.
I mean, it's like the chief of staff leaving the palace. As you said, Rabbi Jacobson, he's totally consumed with the king or the Yechidus room, the Rabbi. And then when he goes out, he's also dubbed to his mission completely, but now he has to take other considerations, so to speak, outside the palace into his consideration. Therefore, it's not mamish, the dveikus is there, but it has to be in relating to the makabel right now already, sort of the beginning of functionality of implementing it. That's beautiful. Thank you.
U'kamoishin is barley ill, as was explained earlier, Dibra Maschel Vasisa Chag Shvuos. Okay, this also goes back to volume 1. It's very clear. I keep pointing it out, but I just taken by it. The Rebbe Rashab is really here as we're coming to the second volume, the conclusion of the second volume. He's mamish tying together very many mamor. How many commissioners barley ills did we have in the last 6 pages? I count at least 20, if not more, maybe 30 even. So he's really tying together a lot of the hemshech here, the different things. So the truth is, it really requires more thought how it all fits together. But what did he say? Commissioners barley ill. That what? Ha'hefresh ben gilei etzem legilei mina etzem. Ah, of course. That was all the way back in, that was the second part of Ayin Beis, where he talked the difference in Eira bli gvul and Eira gvul. So what's the difference in gilei etzem, gilei mina etzem? The gilei mina etzem, listen to these asias. Gilei etzem is the revelation of the source, of the core. Gilei mina etzem means a revelation from the core. So what did he explain? The gilei mina etzem, a revelation from the source, from the core. Humasha atzmus megala eir she'ena lefi eifena atzmus. Beautiful. That atzmus is revealing a light and energy that's not lefi eifena atzmus, which means it's not in the full glory of atzmus's infinite possibilities in every way possible. Ki'im lahoyer esa'elamus. But rather it's a light to radiate to the world, like you just said with the chief of staff, with the other examples I used. The gilei ha'etzem, on the other hand, the gilei ha'etzem, hu masha atzmus megala eir lefi eifena atzmus, completely not commensurate, not tailored, not identifying with anything else. meaning completely without any filters, what he is. He reveals himself through Oir. Now, let's be clear. Remember, mention Atzmus is higher than Oir. And Leize Ikara Atzmus Misava Memena Oir. And he's built the Mitzias Nimtza. And he's Mitzias Atzmuse. So there's plenty where Oir is equal to everything else in the face of Atzmus. But yet, when Atzmus does want to reveal something, it's the Gili Ha'etzem is a revelation of more of an unfiltered, unregulated, just a flow, just Oir. We said the field of energy, God wants existence. We're not talking about any details. There's no spheres, there's no elemus. It's God's expression.
Ein in Yonoi lehoil ha'olamas, he's saying right now.
Oh, he's going to say that? Okay, good. I qualified already. No, Ein in Yoni, this Oir, that's Gili Ha'etzem, Ein in Yoni lehoil ha'olamas, rak legalas atzmuse. So there's two levels of Oir. This level of Oir is its inyan is not to radiate, illuminate the world. Its inyan is just one thing and one thing only, to reveal Atzmus, to reveal what Atzmus is and what Atzmus wants.
Is that an inherent? Okay, go ahead.
One second. So therefore, basically, God shows two types of energy. One, an energy to flow. Obviously, if you're going to want to dir b'tachtenim, an energy to flow, that comes from the etzem, but it's not lefi eifena etzem, meaning it's not, it's that's why you can make a tachtenim. Tachtenim is not eifena etzem. Tachtenim means exactly the opposite. They feel they're a yesh, a separate entity. Gili Elikus is hidden, I and nothing else. Aniva Avsi Eid. Now that's not Oir, obviously, but the Oir has to be one that allows for an existence, for existence to come to take hold. Whereas the Oir, the level of Gili Ha'etzem, all it is Gili Atzmuse, and there's no room for worlds altogether. Even though from there will emerge the other Oir, but in itself, all it is Legalis Atzmuse. Yeah, go ahead. What were you saying?
I was going to ask, is maybe something like Kalo Olam, Kale Olam, that's totally united with it in a way. But my question to you is Rabbi Jacobson, does Etzem itself, is it an inherent aspect of Atzmus that it shines?
Absolutely not. I just said absolutely not. No.
So
it does not say that at all here.
So
I just said Atzmus is beyond. One second. Atzmus is beyond Oir just as much as he's beyond Yesh. But once Atzmus chooses to be Megala, there could be a Gili that's more commensurate to him, reflecting him. And there could be a Gili that relates more to another entity, the existence. That's what he says here. He doesn't say call in Atzmus in Yah. He doesn't say Atzmus comes with Gili. He says Masha Atzmus Megala Eir. He's Megala Eir. The Eir is reflecting him and nothing else.
Okay. But there's a decision there, so to speak, to Megala that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The word decision is we have to be careful what word we use, because there's no rotzen really, but there is definitely that element. Yeah.
Some tenua or something that causes that
we discussed this at length earlier.
Yeah.
Where there's also, remember, the Oir on the other hand is not Megala Mitziusim Atzmuse.
No.
So there's things that the Atzmus is far beyond Oir. We're talking about once there is Gili, God said, I want to create awareness. I want to create bittul. I want to create something that will express me. Now, if you had only the first level of Oir, you'd have a creation, but we'd never have access. Let's say if you had no chief of staff, God in some miraculous way sent orders out to his subjects to do different jobs. You would never really have access to get back into the palace and have an experience of God himself. That would be essentially what you'd have. You want to have the Gili Ha'etzem is an Oir that is as close as possible. It's like when people say they want to see someone who saw the Rebbe. They don't want someone who heard a story about him. They actually saw the Rebbe with his own eyes. They were Chassidim who would go to Chassidim and say, I want to look at the eyes that saw the Rebbe, that saw a Rebbe. What's that? That, in other words, you don't just want what the Rebbe wanted or the Rebbe wrote or something like that. You want to see something that reflects the thing itself as much as possible.
Maybe it's sort of why Hashem had to go through Moshe Rabbeinu rather than just give each of us the Torah, just telepathy or something like that.
That is correct. That's why you have tzaddikim and you have rabbeim in the first place. I agree. You have people who are living examples of what God wants of a human being on this earth. That would be a good example in application. It's not exactly mamish, but the example would be this way you can learn Torah, you can follow all the mitzvahs, but you never have a taste of the complete picture of the human being that 24/7 is just a reflection of Ratzon Hashem. Like we saw the Alter Rebbe, Oves Hen Amarkova, that their lives on earth were exact reflection of Kavanas Ha'atzmos or Ratzon Ha'atzmos. That would be an example. Yeah. Do we finish the parentheses? Let me see here. Let me just see what these lines are, how much explanation they'll need.
He is continuing with a new, I don't know how to call it, knetch.
Okay, so you know what? So better let's leave it for Sunday, because I'd rather learn it slower than just rush through it. So we'll stop here. We're in the middle of a parenthesis talking about the Kav, back and forth. Very powerful stuff. Connecting it to previous Maimonim, which is also great. And we'll continue. We'll stop here. We'll stop here at the bottom of page 1169.